Welcome to UO Today. I'm Steve Shankman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest is Samantha Power, renowned author, journalist, professor, athlete, sports fan, and activist. Samantha Power is the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, A Problem from Hell, America and the Age of Genocide, published in 2002. The book has also been awarded the National Book Critics Circle Award and the Council on Foreign Relations Arthur Ross Prize. She is the Anna Lind Professor of Practice of Global Leadership and Public Policy at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government, and she's here at Oregon as the inaugural Humanities Center Zedek Lecturer. She will be giving a keynote address, the first of the inaugural address of the conference, Witnessing Genocide, Representation and Responsibility. Samantha Power did her undergraduate work at Yale. She earned her law degree from Harvard. She is a former war correspondent who covered events in the former Yugoslavia from 1993 to 96. She reported for U.S. News and World Report, the Boston Globe, and The Economist, and I'm sure other venues as well. Her journalistic work has garnered numerous awards, and she is now working on a political biography of the UN's Sergio Vieira de Mello. Welcome. It's great to have you here.
Great to be here.
So how did you get involved in this? Did you think you were going to write a book on genocide? You were a journalist and a sports fan and
being a Red Sox fan and writing about genocide before 2004 had a lot in common. It felt, but
yeah, that's true. Good point.
Yeah, snatching defeat from the jaws of victory.
Right.
But no, my formative experience, most important experience to this day I've had in my life is right out of college, going to the former Yugoslavia as a journalist, as a stringer, freelancer, and just being inundated with these ghastly images, both of the carnage there, concentration camps again in Europe 50 years after the Holocaust, but also spookier still were the NATO planes that were flying overhead and monitoring what was going on but doing nothing about it. And so in a sort of fit of pique, a prima donna's fit of pique, I said, I got to leave journalism. This is useless. I've been here for 2 years writing. I wrote 1 million words or something for all these different publications. I would write for anybody who would take it. And I just felt like the policy was not changing, was not moving, and so I decided that I was going to go to law school and try to get a tool that was more concrete and that would actually be constructive. I mean, I really was sickened, and there were these war crimes tribunals that had just been set up to punish war crimes and crimes against humanity and genocide, and I thought, oh, maybe I'll get a law degree, I can be a prosecutor and go and get the bad guys. And when I got into law school, though, what I had just experienced was still playing in my mind, and it was at a time when the Holocaust Museum had just opened on the Mall in Washington next to Lincoln and Jefferson, and those memorials. And I just thought, how is it that we are so good at commemorating the Holocaust and saying never again, and in my own very recent experience, so bad at actually doing something to stop these monstrous atrocities which persist, even of a different scale and a different order, of course, than the Holocaust. And so for a paper for a class, I actually set out to answer this question of, how has America responded to the post-Holocaust genocide, crimes of genocide, and to the degree that we have done too little, why is it that we still think of ourselves as a country that does a great deal? What are the stories we're telling ourselves? So my 20-page paper for a class on political theory became an 80-page paper, and then at that, I started asking people, is it surprising to you that we never do anything about genocide, but we think we do? And everybody said, yeah, that's kind of weird. I never really thought of that. And so then I took a year off from law school, and I began work on what would become A Problem from Hell. And 6 years later, it was became a much more ambitious endeavor than I had set out. I think had I known it was going to take 6 or 7 years and entail, traveling to 6 continents and interviewing hundreds of policymakers, I'm not sure I would have had necessarily the stomach for it, because who wants to sign away that number of years? But it was mission creep, and while I was in it, it was incredibly rewarding, because what you encounter through American history, and this is true of most issues, but is not only bystanders, the people who do turn away in the face of this kind of carnage, but these amazing upstanders, people who stood up and put their careers and their lives on the line. And so once I found those people over the course of investigating the bad news, that was sort of an engine that carried me through those years.
Right. So you had your heroes and heroines who...
Yeah, not in a saccharine way, flawed,
right.
human heroes.
Yeah.
but people who were pretty unheralded at the time. So it was a privilege, I just felt really lucky to have stumbled into the project.
It is strange about hope, isn't it? I mean, people can be awful, 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 and then you get just one or two people doing something, and somehow it's very inspiring.
It's also really necessary, it turns out, because not only is it necessary objectively on this earth for us to, salvage the planet, but it turns out that actually, had I written about American acts of bystanding in the face of genocide, whether in the Holocaust or in Rwanda, if I didn't have the person in the room saying, we got to do more, we have to stop the killing, it would be much easier for the, not the protagonist perhaps, but the antagonist, for the people who had willfully looked away or who had deceived themselves and the American people, it would be much easier for their alibis to stick. But the fact that there was someone there who was actually engaged in some kind of conflict actually meant that they had the opportunity to learn more, to know more, to do more, and they chose not to exercise that opportunity for lots of, again, very human reasons. They're not villains of the traditional kind. They're more weak than malicious.
Well, let me ask you about this oblivion of Americans towards genocide, as your book marvelously and in great depth and movingly argues. What is it about, is there anything particularly about America that turns a blind eye? Because there are probably lots of countries that do it. Is there anything that is a particularly American way of not recognizing what's going on?
I don't know. I don't think that the bystanding is unique at all to this country. What is unique to this country is the false promise of never again, and actually just the self-perception we have of ourselves as a country that would engage in moral action. Now, you could argue, in light of recent events, that this is a self-perception that it's a phenomenon. This idea of American exceptionalism and American virtue is far broader than related to genocide or to human rights. But so three things drew me to the United States. One, that I'm of the United States now, and it's my country, and so I feel like we have a responsibility to look around to those closest to us and look at the phenomenon that affect us and that we have the chance to affect. But the two things that I think structurally about the United States make it worth looking at intrinsically is this exaggerated sense of moral virtue, which gives rise to actually a political ripeness in the face of genocide. The very fact that American voters and politicians believe that we are a country that would behave in a certain way in the face of another genocide in the wake of the Holocaust actually creates its own political possibility and political momentum. But the third reason that I think it's important to look at the United States is, of course, the U.S. has the power, given over the last 60 years how much disproportionate might it had. It has the power to achieve so much more with less. And much of what I encountered and documented in the book was not non-intervention, non-military intervention. Of course, the United States isn't risking, maybe people may find it unfortunate, but it's not terribly surprising that the U.S. isn't sending its troops to go and stop genocide in places that it doesn't see in its national interest. What astounded me was that the United States very rarely denounced the crimes, didn't threaten punishment, wouldn't impose economic sanctions, wouldn't support international institutions that might send peacekeepers, wouldn't impose arms embargoes, wouldn't expel diplomats from genocidal countries. It was the toolbox of American foreign policy remained totally shut. And so what's tragic, especially tragic about that, is when you are as powerful as the United States was especially the last couple decades of the 20th century, mere denunciation actually could have gotten in the heads of perpetrators and made a meaningful difference. The mere use of American financial resources and the effort to summon troops from other countries to comprise peacekeeping missions could have made a profound difference. The technology to jam radio in Rwanda that was being used to broadcast the names and addresses of potential victims, only we had that technology. So I think that there's a special responsibility that comes with that kind of power.
Well, let me ask you, because you go into this in your book, this notion of sovereignty, of national sovereignty, which gets in the way of dealing with international crises. And Americans have this idea of private property, staying in your own, this sort of thing. Is that have something to do? What about the issue of sovereignty? Was that part of it? What could you, in a nutshell, just tell us why? What pattern have you seen?
Sure.
That where you can say this is the root of the American obliviousness and inability to take action.
Sure, and I would stress global obliviousness as it happens, shared by the United States. But yeah, I would not make too much of sovereignty, only because we've seen over the course of that same period of the last 60 years an American willingness to trample sovereignty in dozens, if not 100 countries. Whether just with diplomatic meddling or with economic sanctions or with covert operations or assassinations of foreign leaders. I mean, we have a long history of being pretty indifferent to sovereignty when it's in our national interest. So, which brings me to the very boring answer to your question, which is ultimately that stopping genocide in the places that it has occurred over the course of those, the period that I looked at, basically of the 20th century, hasn't advanced or been seen to advance national security and economic interests. And yet the risks of getting involved, even merely diplomatically, economically, some of those softer sanctions I mentioned, are seen to carry genuine political risks. Because there's a feeling of, the very fact that we made all these post-Holocaust commitments, if you call it genocide, if you denounce it, then your brand, if you're Bill Clinton, your presidency is on the line. If you look away entirely, it's just someone else's problem. It's something out there. It's a tribal conflict. However, it's construed. So the ultimate thesis of the book is we don't stop genocide, sadly, at a state level because we don't want to, which is one way to say it. We want genocide stopped. I think there's a genuine will, even among the leading bystanders, a genuine desire to see it stopped. But we don't want to undertake the economic, political, military risks required to do the stopping. And let me just add that, because this is, I think, the most important ingredient, the only way that human rights issues usually get on the policy radar and get pursued and earn a seat at the table with economic and security interests is when there is sustained domestic political pressure from the Congress or in some kind of grassroots, but effective grassroots way. And in the cases of genocide in the 20th century, you never saw that kind of pressure being brought to bear, with one exception, that was in Bosnia. And the reason an intervention finally did take place in 1995 in Bosnia was President Clinton felt like he was going to pay a domestic political price for doing nothing about genocide. And that's the first time any American president had ever felt that.
So in that sense, American democracy then comes at a price. I mean, if you're reflecting the will of the people, and the representatives the people who are representing the people do not feel it's in their political self-interest to do something, nothing is going to happen. So how do you raise consciousness isn't it the responsibility of leaders to do that? And isn't it time really now to think in much more global terms?
Definitely. It's a tricky thing, though, because when, on the rare occasions in U.S. history where values have been injected into the policy process, what has tended to happen is the legislature insists for a time, whatever the public groundswell was that gave rise to the legislative effort, or the congressional groundswell was that gave rise to the belated executive effort, fades. And then the executive branch doesn't have that top-down will that you're talking about to inject, to humanize, American foreign policy, to inject moral concerns or human rights concerns into decision-making. So it has tended to happen in a very ad hoc, a la carte, spasmodic way. And as a result, what you see is often, it's almost worse than if moral issues had never been injected at all, because you raise expectations in certain communities, or you get convinced of your own hubris because you have good intentions that somehow convinces you that you're going to execute a policy in a moral way, which isn't at all always the case. So, I mean, I take your point. I think democracy is dangerous in that who votes in the United States? The victims of genocide in Rwanda don't vote. The victims of the victims of the occupation in Iraq aren't voting. So what happens is there's a corrective in our system that can sometimes, if we're at stake, that can stop the worst harms to U.S. interests as defined domestically. But it is very rare that you see the kind of bubbling up. But having said that, You see it much more in this country than you see it in any other Western democracy.
What?
The bubbling up, the fact that constituents actually take it upon themselves
to do something,
to alert their leaders and to tell them that this matters to me. As I said, in Bosnia, there would have been no intervention. There'd still be concentration camps, for all I know, in the former Yugoslavia today, had that pressure from Jewish groups and students and human rights actors and members of Congress in the 90s not force Clinton's hand. Darfur would be the entire, I mean, the region is on fire as it is, but it would be obliterated at this point, if not for this bottom-up pressure from students and evangelicals and Jewish groups again, and some of these sort of unlikely bedfellows that have combined to demand that their leaders do more.
But isn't there also, and I don't want to, keep pushing this point, but you talk about the self-interest of the United States. We always argue in that way that this is in the self-interest of the United States. We're going to invade Iraq because it's in the self-interest of the United States. Why isn't there a more enlightened way to look at it? That it's in the interest of humanity to do this kind of thing. Why can't people take that position?
Well, I think first of all, it's raison d'etat. I think it's most countries' leaders are less far-sighted than we would have them be. They are rooted in electoral cycles, and the more money becomes a part of politics, so much of governing these days is about catering to those who put you in a position to govern in the first place. I don't mean to sound so cynical about it, but it's what's frustrating is that I would even be, even if we take self-interest, what's astounding is the degree to which our policies that appear to be rooted in self-interest in the short term are utterly counterproductive from an economic and a national security perspective in the medium to long term. And so part of what perhaps offers some hope, especially when one thinks about the so-called war on terror, is the degree to which by actually violating human rights massively, as we have done in the conduct of this alleged war, we have created much more of a national security calamity than had we actually behaved by international rules. And so there you're going to see the national security, the self-interest corrective, hopefully, on practices that many Americans find abhorrent. Genocide is harder because the risks of getting involved are real. We can't be, also airy-fairy about how easy it is to go into someone else's country or to be, wagging your finger from outside, especially now when you have so little moral authority. So, it's very, very complex. What I find really disappointing is that in other Western democracies, where there is a slightly, potentially you could say, a more enlightened conception of self-interest insofar as it's reflected in more generous foreign aid allocations, more generous development assistance, more of a contribution to the UN and so forth, peacekeeping. But even those countries, when it comes to genocide, it's just they want very little to do with it.
Let me ask you about genocide. And do you think that term is helpful?
Not really.
Yeah, because you talk about Pol Pot, and in what sense is that? In other words, there's murder, there's mass murder. What advantage does it have to? And I know you write very movingly of this unusual person who invented the word genocide and who was a crusader for it, but it seems to me to raise a lot of issues, and maybe part of what's going on in Darfur is people can't quite see that as genocide. I mean, you have the Nazis going after the Jews, and this is genocide. It somehow, murder is murder, and so what is the advantage of genocide as a term?
Well, it definitely carries sociological and legal advantages. I mean, to talk in these ways is sort of absurd, of course, to talk about the advantages of genocide. But by that I mean, because the word genocide is associated with the Holocaust, there is a bite to it, there is a stigma to it, there is a cachet, if you will, to it in certain quarters that simply saying massive crimes against humanity or mass atrocity doesn't have the same. So I'll give you an example of that, and then I'll come back to your point, which I think is in balance. I agree with you, but there are some advantages. One example would be Colin Powell used the word genocide to describe the atrocities in Darfur in September 2004. And I happen to think that this was a total waste of advocacy time for us to go and try to get him to use the word basically because I had your view. Then we'd end up debating, was it genocide or wasn't it, rather than debating what we should do to stop mass atrocity. In retrospect, I realized I was, from a domestic perspective, totally wrong, because as soon as the legal determination of genocide was handed down by the State Department, the first in its history in the midst of a sitting genocide, an ongoing genocide, Jewish groups in this country, it just set off sirens. It gave the issue a legitimacy and almost a grandiosity. You know, it was a grand summons to an entire, very, very active, very influential community in this country. They've been incredibly useful. Similarly, I teach at Harvard University. Harvard was the first private university to divest its endowment of funds, basically with companies doing business in Sudan. And the way that Harvard, the corporation, which never wants to get into moral questions or human rights questions, very few private universities or private pension funds or anything, want to do that. But the way they were able to justify it to themselves and to their shareholders was, listen, we're not going to do human rights screening of our money. That would just be too expensive. We're here to make a profit. That's what money management is about. However, there are certain circumstances that are so egregious and so outrageous, and genocide is that circumstance. And so we can divest on, from companies doing business in Sudan without then having to open ourselves up to looking at companies doing business in a whole bunch of other, dangerous and messy places. So that's the kind of, there's a political spike and a political advantage that is real and I think has to be taken seriously. In addition, of course, there's a legal, jurisdictional bite that you get when something borders on genocide or rises to the level of genocide. That is less important now that you have an international criminal court that punishes war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. But nonetheless, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, is only going to take cases that rise to a certain threshold. In other words, it's only going to do a handful of cases every year. And so to sort of get on the radar, to get on the list of most wanted, if you've committed genocide versus merely war crimes, you're much more likely, I think, to cross their threshold of gravity of offense. So that's all the reasons that I understand why people work so hard to use the word.
Yeah.
But to your point, I mean, more generally, the reason countries don't do anything about genocide isn't because they're confused about whether it's genocide or not. It is because of this political cost-benefit analysis. And, to some degree, getting the label attached creates the specter in a democracy that you're actually going to be known as a president who allowed genocide. That's what started to haunt Clinton at the end of his time in 1999. That's why he did a lot more about Kosovo than he had about Bosnia and Rwanda. But that is an advantage. But beyond that, it's the atrocities themselves. It's the details of what's actually being done to families. It's the lives being, rented apart. Those are the details that are going to mobilize people, housewives and students and particular influential constituencies. And what happens as soon as you use the word is you end up in this endless, interminable, and totally unsatisfying and unanswerable, unresolvable debate about whether the term should apply and whether it is sufficiently like the Holocaust or is sufficiently like Rwanda. And what I say to people is, even though, you say, well, Darfur doesn't look quite like the Holocaust didn't look like the Holocaust at the time. At the time, in other words, if you're talking about 1940, 1941, 42, did we really, there was a lot of evidence of mass murder for sure, and there was a report in 1941 of 1 million people already killed in the Daily Telegraph and so forth, and there was stuff being leaked out. But would we have met the threshold of certainty that people demand, for contemporary crimes? And I'm not sure we would have. And you would have had that debate, is it genocide or is it not? Whereas, of course, in the Holocaust in Rwanda, the debate we want to be having is, in the case of the Holocaust, bomb the train tracks or not, leave with the German people or not, let more refugees in or not, and I just feel like, again, would terminology have really helped us in those days? There were other issues.
Yeah. Although, Rwanda, I mean, it may have just appeared, well, here are two different tribes, so somehow the world didn't rise. It didn't have the drama of, one group. And even in Darfur, it seems like people have difficulty conceptualizing what exactly is going on, so that in a certain sense, it almost doesn't rise enough to the level of genocide, it seems to me, in people's consciousness, so that they feel absolutely compelled to do something. I don't know if that's your take on it.
Darfur has produced something really, I don't know what it's like on this campus, but really interesting. And actually, I don't have that impression that you've described. I'm actually stunned at the degree to which it is resonating for people. I don't understand why it is resonating. I mean, this is a time where we have Guantanamo, we're bogged down in Iraq, several 100,000 people at a minimum have been killed in Iraq as a result. I mean, we have so many things. We have North Korea, Iran, Afghanistan, the Arab-Israeli situation.
Yeah,
How is it that we have the largest anti-genocide movement in the history of the United States afoot today at the time of these national security challenges, self-imaging challenges, behavioral challenges? It's what's going on. I mean, I was in, this time last year, in fact, this very weekend last year, a year ago, there was an enormous rally, on the Mall in Washington. 85,000 people showed up. 85,000 people. It's not large compared to the immigration marches and so forth, but I would say of those 85,000 people, probably 500 had ever met a person from Darfur. The other 84,000 something were just motivated by a genocide, word of a genocide in Darfur. Has anybody ever heard of Darfur 5 years ago? I mean, something's going on in the country, and I think it's young people are really at the heart of it, which is the exciting part.
I really hope you're right about it.
I hope I'm right too.
And I hope something gets done and keeps getting done fast. In the minute and a half or so that we have left, would you say that genocide is going on now in Iraq? I mean, you've got Sunnis and Shiites who are killing each other. Is this genocide?
I would hate to sound like that very unfortunate State Department spokesperson during the Rwanda genocide, Christine Shelley, who got into an awful lot of trouble by saying, no, it's not genocide in Rwanda, it's acts of genocide. And then to which Reuters reporter said, well, after she hemmed and hawed for a minute and a half, in which time 100 Rwandans had been killed, the reporter said, well, how many acts of genocide does it take to make a genocide? Because she was evading the use of the term. But I'm actually, so at the risk of sounding like her, I think there's no question that acts of genocide are being carried out. When you go to a checkpoint and it is a death sentence to simply have a Sunni last name or a Shia last name in another neighborhood, when people are systematically being butchered, not on the basis of anything they have done as individuals, but simply on the basis of sectarian identity, that is genocidal violence. The reason I say it's not a genocide as such is genocide, of course, is rooted in top-down, systematic intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, or religious group, and it's hard to find the center of gravity such that one can see that kind of, what we saw in the Holocaust, what we saw in Rwanda, what we see in Darfur, that cabal of top-down desire to destroy. But it's close. We're well in the red zone.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but it seems to me, since we're there, why doesn't the international community really get involved in this big time and deal with it instead of the so-called
self-interest?
Yeah.
Self-interest. I mean, no one, just as Americans
no one wants to get, exactly.
We want to come home. Why would anybody want to go in?
Yeah. Samantha Power, it's been great speaking with you.
Nice to talk to you as well. Thanks for having me.
And we've been speaking with Samantha Power, a noted author, and a famous book, Pulitzer Prize winning book on genocide. Thank you for being with us.